Hello again, and welcome to another lesson. This is the final lesson for the series Becoming the Rock, kind of looking at who Peter the disciple was, and trying to understand him in a better light, not only just to understand who he was, but also to help us as Christians, as followers of Christ, to understand that we can learn a lot about not only ourselves, but about how we're supposed to follow Christ by learning about the disciple named Peter. Over the past couple of weeks, I would encourage you to go back and re-watch, if you haven't already, those videos about the previous lessons, because pretty much each lesson kind of builds on the other as we dive deeper and deeper into who Peter really is by looking at different stories about him. But today, we're going to end our time with Peter by looking at the last scene that we have of Peter and Jesus. And this scene comes to us from the Gospel of John. Down in the description, I will put down the exact reference in the book of John that you'll find this story. But John is the only one that gives us this story. And it is after Easter, it is after the resurrection, and Jesus finds Peter. And to start the whole story off, we find the interesting piece that Jesus finds Peter exactly where he found Peter 3 years ago. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus calls Peter to him, you remember this from the first lesson, we talked about the call of Peter. Where does Jesus find him? He finds him fishing. He finds him doing his job. And now, 3 years later, after Christ has died and has been buried, Peter is beside himself. He doesn't know what to do, so what does he do? He goes back and does what he already knows how to do. He goes back and becomes a fisherman. And Jesus goes and finds him on the Sea of Galilee in his boat fishing. And he does the exact same thing that he did at the very beginning. Tells him, throw the nets on the other side of the boat to catch the fish. Now, Peter does the same thing. Casts his net on the other side. The nets fill to the brim with fish, and Peter realizes right then and there that the man that is standing on the beach is none other than his master. And so Peter, without any forethought, without any question, dives into the water and swims back to the shore. Doesn't wait to turn the boat around, doesn't wait to bring in the fish. He just dives in and he swims all the way back to see his Savior, his Messiah, his Master. And here we see that Peter has not lost his passion and his desire for Christ. Has not lost his love for the Master that he served for 3 years. He is so excited to see him again. Now, in this story, I believe we find probably the most instructional piece, not just of Peter, but of how Jesus deals with Peter for us as Christians today. Because in this story, you'll remember just a little while ago, when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter does a couple of things incorrectly. Some of them out of passion and love for Christ, but others out of just ignorance and selfishness. The first thing that Peter does, as soon as Jesus is arrested, he attacks someone. He is the one who draws the sword and takes the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus has to rebuke him and say, put down the sword. The second thing that Peter does that shows that he doesn't understand who Jesus is, because the first one, violence. Violence was never a part of what Jesus was about. Never did he say anything about violence other than forgive, turn the other cheek, do everything except violence. And yet Peter's first response is, I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight for my master. I'm going to fight for him to be freed. And Jesus looks at him and says, you really haven't learned what you're supposed to learn yet, have you? Put down the sword. This is what it's supposed to be. But the second thing and the most and more important piece of what happens on that night is when Peter fulfills Jesus' statement to him. Jesus prophesies at the upper room that Peter will deny him 3 times before the cock crows. And even though in the upper room, Peter declares as loudly and as forcibly as he can that he will not deny Christ, that he would never deny Christ, he ends up doing exactly that in the gardens of Caiaphas' house. He denies 3 different times the accusation that he is a member of this group of people that followed Jesus. Now, to be fair, we can understand that Peter is scared to death. He is to be fair, he is in the middle of the lion's den when he is at Caiaphas' house. He knows that things are going poorly. He knows that he sees the writing on the wall that this might be the end of everything, and that he also realizes that if they figure out that he is part of the group that Jesus was part of, that Jesus was leading, he's probably going to get the same treatment that Jesus is getting. And fact is that when it comes to that point, everyone turns to that fight or flight reaction. And Peter, as we can understandably understand him, sits there and says, I'm not ready to die. I'm not ready to go through that. So he saves his own skin by claiming that he has no idea who this man Jesus is. Now, fast forward a little bit to the story we have this lesson with John. And we see that Peter has been mulling over this for a while. He has to have. Not only did he watch Jesus die and see him buried, but he then also was told by Mary Magdalene that the tomb was empty. He runs to the tomb, he checks it, he sees that it is empty, and he walks away. And now he realizes that not only is he sorrowful that he denied his Savior, he denied his Messiah, which he promised and swore that he would never do, but now he's lost his master, like completely. The master that he served is no longer even present in the tomb, and he has no idea where he is. And so we get to this lesson. And Jesus calls to Peter and the others that are in the boats, and he tells and he reenacts that story at the very beginning of the first time they met. And Peter recognizes him almost immediately. He swims to shore and comes to see him. And it is here that we get this beautiful interaction between Peter and Jesus. Jesus, the risen Lord, sits at the campfire roasting fish and eating together with his disciples. And he turns to Peter the very first time, and you can just kind of imagine. And as you know, I like reading kind of between the lines of the stories and kind of trying to fill in what the story looked like at that point. And you can almost see, when you close your eyes and read the story from John, them sitting around the campfire and Peter stuffing his face and looking at Jesus and reminiscing on all the times that they had done this before in the last 3 years, and hoping that things would be back to normal, that he would be following Christ again, listening to his lessons and watching him perform the miracles that he performs. And Jesus turns around to him and looks at him and says, Peter, do you love me? And you can almost hear in the first response of Peter that he kind of nonchalantly answers the question. He's like, of course I love you. You know, that's a stupid question. You know, he just keeps going on. He doesn't understand the depth of that question. And so when Jesus asks him, he kind of blows it off and says, of course I love you, Jesus. You know that. And he goes on, and Jesus looks at him and says, okay, then feed my sheep. But Jesus knows Peter. Jesus knows that Peter didn't understand anything that just transpired. And so Jesus, a little bit later, does the same thing. Peter, do you love me? This time it kind of catches a little bit with Peter. Again, you can see the answer that Peter gives. It's still kind of I'm not really sure where you're going with this, Jesus. I'm not really sure why you're asking me this question. Didn't you ask me this before? But maybe I didn't understand it last time. So yes, of course I love you. It's not until the third time that Jesus asks him that Peter realizes what Jesus is driving at. Because then Jesus looks at him, and you can, again, when you read the story, you can tell that there's something different about this question. It's as if Jesus finally got Peter's full attention. He looked at him directly in the eyes, and he asks him this question: Peter, do you love me? And this third time is the charm. Peter recognizes what is going on. He understands that this question isn't just a simple yes or no question. This is a question that will make or break his life. Peter stares into the eyes of his Messiah, of his Master, the one who he alone claimed was the Son of the living God. And he looks at Jesus and he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Now notice the difference in the answer. The first two answers are simply between two guys. Yeah, I love you. I love you like a brother. But it's this answer that truly shows Peter understanding his first answer to Christ's question, who do you say that I am? You are the Son of the living God. And Peter looks to Jesus and he says, you know everything. Now in this one answer, Peter is recognizing two things. The first thing he's recognizing is that Jesus knew Peter would deny him. Yes, Peter denied that he would deny him. He avidly vowed that he would never do that. But now he knows Jesus wasn't just guessing. Jesus wasn't just predicting. He knew Peter would deny him. And so Peter's answer to Jesus is, Jesus, you know everything. And the second part of the answer, you know I love you. Peter is recognizing that Jesus is giving him a second chance. Sure, he denied. And Jesus doesn't claim to say that that never transpired or take that away. But Peter understands that now Jesus is asking him and he's saying, you now know what it means. Now you know what it means to say, I love you. It means that you will give up your life in pursuit of the will that I was pursuing. Jesus did everything he did for one purpose and one purpose alone. The will of God, the will of his Father. He expects nothing less from his followers. Peter had to learn that lesson. When he goes to Caiaphas' house for the trial of Jesus, he does not understand that that is what Jesus is doing. That it will cost him his life to follow the will and do the will of God. Peter doesn't understand that yet. But once he denies Christ 3 times, once he sees the empty tomb, he now understands what it means to do the will of God. That it will take his life. And that it takes an even stronger love of the Son in order to fulfill that prophecy. In order to do that will. And Peter understands this now. And so Jesus asks him, Peter, do you love me? And it's not just a question of affection. The question goes deeper than that. The question goes so deep that it means that you will give your life for me. That you will give your life for the will of our Father. And it is here that Peter realizes this and understands that, yes, he is able to do that now. He was not able to do that when he was first called. He was not able to do that when he answered the question correctly. He was not even able to do that in the upper room or in the Garden of Gethsemane or even at Caiaphas' house. He was not ready to do that when he saw the empty tomb. But now that he has had time, he is ready. Now, for those of us that are Christians now, followers of Christ now, Christ does the same thing for us. And I think that this, as I said, this for me is the most instructive part of who Peter is, that instructs me as a Christian, and I hope instructs so many others as followers of Christ. 2 things. The first is that Jesus goes to someone who is completely broken, who has denied him time after time again, 3 times to be exact, and said, I still need you. I still want you. You can still be useful to God's plan. Will you do it? And for those of us that are Christians and those of us that follow Christ, or even those that are just beginning that journey, it is a great relief and hope that no matter how many times we have screwed up in the past, no matter how many times we have denied Christ or denied God in the way we live or the way we act or what we say or anything else, that Jesus still sits down and he says, do you love me? And secondly, we see that the second part, not only does it not matter what we've done in the past, but what we've done in the past will influence our future. Peter could not have been prepared to answer that question correctly had it not been for the fact that he denied Christ 3 times. Because now he knows what it feels like to live with that guilt, even for just a short period of time. And he recognizes the fact that he never wants to live that way again. And so now there is something that drives him. And it is the past mistake. And it will make him into the Peter that is the apostle above pretty much all apostles. Peter learns from his mistakes and gains a second chance from Christ to be the man that God had always intended him to be. For you and me, as Christians in 2019, the same campfire is lit. The same Messiah is sitting at it, and he's saying the same thing to you and me. Do you love me? Every time we make a mistake, every time we go down the wrong path, you know where we end up? At that same campfire with him looking us in the eyes saying, do you love me? And when we say yes, he says, great. Go feed my sheep. I don't care what you did before. Let that fuel you. Become my Father's instrument. Build his kingdom here. And every time you make a mistake, you'll end up right back here with the same question, searching for the same answer. Do you love me?